leadership at Department of Transportation and Federal Highway recognizes that we have compelling reasons to support floodplain management. And here are a few of them that kind of open up folks' eyes. There are 500,000 bridges and large culverts over waterway. Their average age is 1966. So we have aging infrastructure. We have infrastructure where a lot of it was built before there was a National Insurance Act. This does not include the countless numbers of smaller culverts and storm drains and bridges across the country. So we are definitely impacting our floodplains and the environments of the floodplains and watersheds. Of those 500,000 bridges, 50,000 of those bridges are subject to what we call occasional overtopping. And that means that the bridges or the embankments and approach sections are subject to overtopping from a 10-year or less frequency storm. So we're already experiencing a 10% of our inventory of bridges are at risk from some type of flooding incident. 60 to 70% of all failures of bridges have a hydraulic component as a major constituent of that failure. So when we lose I-35 up in Minnesota, that's a tragedy, that's a disaster. But it wasn't a hydraulic. That's more the exception than the rule. More likely, we're faced with things like Interstate 10 in Escambia Bay in Florida after Ivan, or losing the US 90 bridges in Biloxi and Bay St. Louis, and I-10 in Lake Pontchartrain. Plus, all the small structures up and down around the country where essentially even minor flooding causes failure. That's essentially a compelling reason why we have to start thinking better and more aligned with the floodplain values. Another point, every year, Federal Highway has been spending an average of $300 million in emergency relief funds. So in addition to this $42 billion, we've been spending $300 million on emergency relief of our structures. Now granted, not all of that relief funding is going to hydraulic and floodplain related issues, but it's still about 60 or 70%. That's a large investment that we cannot sustain over a long period of time. And I think the final point is the argument that we make is that we as a transportation community, we are part of the floodplain community, and we have to essentially align ourselves to make sure the floodplain community works to its most efficient way it can. Now, as anyone can tell you, we've experienced a mixed success in this balancing act. Some of the state DOTs do a very admirable job in their floodplain management approaches and objectives. For example, they correctly, or as best they can, apply federal highway, FEMA, state and local regulations and statutes to their projects. This may mean, for example, instead of building an embankment into the floodway, they may essentially try to span the entire floodplain itself. They also do something I think is important and a part of the spirit of NFIP. They coordinate and cooperate with the NFIP communities. A lot of times, those state DOTs have hydraulic expertise and experience that they should be sharing with those communities so that we can decrease the risk to those communities. That information that was developed in these, for example, a bridge construction plan, that should be going out to the communities that may be affected so they can better manage their own NFIP. What's not known is a lot of the state DOTs use their federal aid funds to help fund updates to, for example, USGS regression equations and funding NOAA precipitation studies. We actually have several pooled fund studies around the country that Federal Highway and the states are engaged in, where we're actually working with NOAA to update rainfall precipitation maps and precipitation maps. It'd be nice if we could get more federal agencies to work with the states and, for example, update these regression equations or these rainfall data not on a 40-year basis, but maybe on a more frequent and frequent basis. Now, those are good things, but again, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, states, DOTs, do not always support floodplain management. And there's a lot of reasons. Some are just basically, they are just too cheap to basically pay for the CLOMAR-LOMAR, or they think they are. I tell them, wait a minute, most of that money is federal cost share. We'll pay 80% of that money anyway. You have no excuse not to essentially participate in the NFIP process. We're working with the states to do that. When we find out, we work to help to change that behavior. Some of those impediments are institutional. For example, a lot of state design practices and guidelines are based on certain storm events. For example, most bridges are designed to a 50-year the design event. This can cause problems that are unforeseen. For example, after Katrina, if we were going to rebuild, for example, the US 90 bridge, Mississippi's drainage policies and standards would have required them to rebuild that bridge to the same elevation that we know destroyed it. So again, we had to work to come up with some different and alternative ways to work with the floodplain, work with expected conditions, and come up with some different standards. And that's been a challenge. So I'll certainly take a lot of, well, I'll put a bullseye around my chest and you all can come up with maybe hundreds and hundreds of other ways that the transportation community is not pulling their weight. However, I'd suggest to you that there are other reasons that may be an issue of not necessarily the transportation community, but we as the floodplain community. For example, over the years, I've seen a lot of poor communication, some poor administration. We see deviations and conflicts in policies and programs. And we start seeing the common siloing effect that we've become part of the status quo. It's hard for me to plan a transportation. I want to replace those bridges that have an average age of 41 years, 44 years. It's hard for me to plan for that if I know if I go from one watershed, I'm held to one type of standard, and if I go to another watershed, I'm held to a different type of standard. I can't plan for that. I think we would much rather have a consistent and a unified approach so that whatever community you work with, whatever jurisdiction you work with, whatever watershed you work with, we can essentially plan and allocate our resources effectively. It's not fair that one state essentially is spending more time and effort to do good floodplain management values because of the strong state and local floodplain ordinances and approaches, where another state, basically we may fall back on the de minimis that's a part of the FEMA floodplain regulations. So those are things I kind of throw out as something that concerns the transportation community. We need to improve it. And Ed already started talking about the means that the federal agencies are going to do that. We need your insights. We need your thoughts. We need you to basically come back and give us what are we doing right and what are we doing wrong? What can we do better? The status quo is not good enough anymore. That's why, from the Secretary on down, the U.S. Department of Transportation is committed to working with the floodplain community and our federal agencies and our state partners to resolve and improve these policies and create programs that are aimed to preserve and restore the vital resources of floodplain environment. Once again, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to some interesting questions.